Good afternoon. I've travelled all the way down from Suffolk. Is that your Essex welcome for a Suffolk lad? I'm going to start again. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you kindly. Right, today's talk is about the history of spoken English. So we're going to go through time. We're going to go from the ancient Britons to today, where the English actually came from, how Chaucer and Shakespeare was really spoken, because standard English hadn't been invented by those times, how public school pronunciation was invented in the late 1700s, and why today we still have accents, and including a dialect tour of the British Isles and further afield, showing how a deaf person can lip read and tell you what dialect you have, and why our authors have been translated around the world, and how English has become the richest language in the world. So we're going to start with the Romans. Now, we were British, we were Brythonic, speaking a language very, very similar to Welsh and Cornish today. Then the Romans arrived, and they stayed for roughly 350 years, and they left in the early 400s, the early 5th century. They left behind a British people speaking a British tongue. Only the chieftains on the eastern side of the country had a smattering of ancient Greek and Latin. But 99.9% of the population were still talking in a Brythonic tongue, similar to Welsh and Cornish. Then the English arrive. This is still the 5th century. The English arrive. And it's a generic term for 4 tribes. So where did they come from? Well, I've done a little map earlier. Clacton. Northwest Europe, right? So we've got Jutland. The Jutes came from northern Jutland, Jutland. The Angles came from mid-Jutland, from a place called Angolan. And it was so called because there was a little peninsula shaped like a fishhook, and their word for a fishhook was angle. That's why it's called Angolan, and that's why they're called Angles. It's also when you go to the Chelmer and you put an angle on the end of a line, you become anglers, and you are angling because you've got an angle on the end of your line. I'm glad they didn't call it a hook. For those that didn't cotton on, otherwise we'd be the land of the hookers rather than the angles. The Saxons came from present-day Holstein. I was giving this talk to a U3A, and a gentleman stood up and said, "Mr. Haylock, I would suggest to you that the Saxons come from Saxony and not from Holstein like you've suggested. The name does give you a clue." I went, "Right." He said, "They've done DNA testing in Saxony and it's full of Saxon blood. So therefore the Saxons come from Saxony and not from Holstein like you've suggested. And what do you say to that?" I said, "Not a lot. What you forget, sir, is that DNA testing also tells you where you went to as well as where you came from. And when the Saxons in the 5th century left their homeland, the vast majority went south, and the area they took over was named after them, Lower Saxony, because there were Saxons still left higher up. And the Saxons that came over to this country, the area they took over was also named after them. The East Saxons, the Middle Saxons, the West Saxons and South Saxons, which ends up the Essex, the Middle Sax, the West Sax and the Sud Sax. Now that doesn't take a lot of working out, does it, sir? Essex, Middlesex, Wessex and Sussex. And if you did DNA testing in Essex, it is full of Saxon blood. But the Saxons did not come from Essex. And what do you say to that? He said, "Not a lot," and he sat down. And the audience cheered. Yes. The Frisians came from the Frisian Islands and northern Netherlands. Those 4 tribes are generically known as the Anglish, right? The Angles were far and away more than the other 3 put together by a long, long way. Then later on, when we get to the 700s and the like, we get to the Danes, right? Because all these tribes, they spoke the same language, although different dialects. So therefore, a Frisian could speak to a Jute, and an Angle could speak to a Saxon. And within their own groups, they would have their own dialect changes, just the same way that South Essex is different to North Essex, just the same way as East Suffolk is different to West Suffolk. So therefore, they would have a dialect change in their own groups, but they all spoke the same language. We've also got to remember Sweden. So in Uppsala, there is a burial ship that is exactly the same. And when I say exactly, I mean exactly the same as the one at Sutton Hoo. Not only in the shape of the boat, but also the treasures that they found, the armoury they found, and all the little patterns, the swirls and whirls, exactly the same. Because the Woffingers, who were an offshoot of the Swedish royal family, came over and settled through them up into Angolan. And then they came over as the ruling classes of the Angles. Now, what we've got to remember is that even today, the V sound in some of the Swedish dialects is pronounced as a W. So the V is pronounced as a W. We must remember that. Right, so this lot, as you've got the Yeats, Beowulf's lot, right. So the southern Swedes have had an effect in our language. We've also got to remember that the Norwegians in 905, these were the Norsemen, the Northmen, the Normans, and they went down and invaded northern France, and that's where they stayed. And the area they took over was eventually named after them, Normandy. So the Normans that came down from Rollo in 905 came down, right. So this is all coming over to this country eventually. Where did they land? Well, this is another map I did earlier. The Jutes, they took over the east side of present-day Kent. Along the south coast, Isle of Wight, a little bit of Hampshire. They were the Jutes. The Saxons, they came in, so you had the East Saxons, you had the Middle Saxons, you had the West Saxons, up to the present-day Cornish-Devon border, and you had the South Saxons. That is the Saxon bit of Anglo-Saxon. And when the Saxons, as we're in Chelmsford, right, as the Saxons came over, there was a Saxon chieftain called Chelmer, and he found a Roman encampment that had translated Caesar's marketplace, which was then the old name for Chelmsford. He took it over and he then controlled it, where the ford was on the river. And so it then became known as Chelmer's Ford. And then the river was named after him as well. So Chelmsford does not mean a ford over the River Chelmer. Chelmsford was already named Chelmer's Ford, and then the river was named after him as well. So that's the Saxon bit. So the Angles, you've got, the Angles came in. These were the first lot. They settled at a place called Ipswich, as they called it. Right. Then more Angles came in, and then they were the Mid-Angles. Then you've had Mercia, Lindsey, present-day Lincolnshire, and then Northumbria, north of the, up to Edinburgh. They were the Angle territories. And over on the continent, we were known as either Angles, Engles, or Ingles. Right? They haven't called us Saxon land. So in the northern parts of Europe, it's England, England. And then you get to Angleterre, land of the Angles. The French don't call us English, they call us les Anglais, the Angles. And then you get to Italy and Spain, and it's Inglaterra, Inglaterra, the land of the Ingles. So therefore, that is the biggest chunk. The Frisians came in with the East Angles and the Jutes. And then together, especially around the River Stour, right, the English language started to evolve. And we get the first inkling of early Old English. The British weren't too happy with this lot coming in, and a lot of them emigrated over to the West. They became strangers in their own country, and the Old English word for stranger is Walish. Walish. So that area there became known as Walish. Right? The ancient kingdom of Kern, or Kernow, became known as Kernwalish. Cornwallis, Cornwall. And some Britons said, blow this for a game, and they emigrated to northern France. And the area they took over eventually became known as Brittany. And today, a Breton, a Cornish person, and a Welshman speaking their own natural tongue, very, very similar, and they'll be able to understand one another. So that's what went on from the 5th century onwards. I was at a U3A, another U3A, and a bloke stood up and said, Mr. Haylock, could you be more specific, please? You said the 5th century 6 times. I said, well, it's over 100 years and it's sort of come in waves. He said, surely it can be more specific than just the 5th century. Surely, it's 100 years. I said, well, yes, I can. That was 3:30 on a Friday afternoon. He sat down, yes. So we've now got this mix. Then we have the 700s. We then have the Danes coming in. And they had a tremendous effect on the English language, they really did. And in they came, all the way down to the Somerset levels. They'd also come round and down on the south coast as well. That was where the first attacks took place. And then it came in with Lindisfarne and what have you, and eventually down to the Somerset levels. Alfred hid up, King Alfred hid up. And somehow we got an army together. And he then started pushing back. And he took a lot of angles on side. Now, he was a Wessex, King of Wessex, right? But he took a lot of angles in. And he was the first person to come out with Anglish and English, although he was a Saxon, because he wanted to keep them on side. They'd become allies. And there were more Angles in his army than there were Saxons. And there was a famous battle up on the River Orwell, a Battle of Bloody Point. This was in 885. And the English won. Although they lost more boats and lost more men, they still pushed them back. And in the next year, the Danelaw was drawn up. And the Danelaw was the Essex side of London, and it then sort of zigzagged across, and everything south of that was controlled by the English, and everything north of that by the Danes, the Danelaw. And we then get, because they spoke the same language as the English, but a different dialect, they did struggle a bit, because this new mix was a little bit different to what it was over in the continent. So when you've got two people talking to one, just the same way as if me was to talk in a very, very broad Suffolk dialect, talking to someone from Northumbria in their broad dialect, we would struggle understanding one another, and the refineries of the language have to go out the window. Well, this is what happened when the Danes met this new English mix. So in Old English and in Old Norse, you had male nouns, female nouns, and neuter. And you then had, right, in those groups, you had strong nouns and weak nouns. So the adjective that went with all those nouns, depending on what it was, you had to change all the spellings. Well, when I gave this talk in schools, the kids used to say, thank you, Danes, because they got rid of all the males and females and neuters, and it ended up the. So you don't have to worry about if it's a female cat or a chair or a male this or that. It's just the. And you don't have to change all the spellings of the adjectives. Thank you, Danes. When the king meets the bishop, the king meets the bishop. When you swap it around, so the bishop meets the king, the subjects become the objects become the subject, and now we've got to change some spellings, like you have to do in German today. But because of the Danes, the king meets the bishop, swap it around, the bishop meets the king, and we don't have to change any spellings. Thank you, Danes. And also the plural system was horrendous. Dependent on whether it was male, female, neuter, whether it's a strong or a weak noun, you could add an en, n, es, s, you could add an a, you could add all sorts of ways of making a plural. But because of the Danes, we added es on the end, s, or kept it the same. But we have still some leftovers from that period today. And I've got a little poem here about English plurals, and it reflects some of the old plurals that we used to have and still got. We'll begin with a box, and the plural is boxes, but the plural of ox becomes oxen, not oxes. One fowl is a goose and two are called geese, yet the plural of moose should never be meese. You may find a mouse in a nest full of mice, yet the plural of house is houses, not house. If the plural of man is always called men, why shouldn't the plural of pan be pen? If I spoke of my foot and I show you my feet, if I give you a boot, a pair should be beat. If one is a tooth and the whole set of teeth, why can't the plural of booth be beef? Then one would be that and three would be those, yet hat in the plural would never be hose, and the plural of cat would never be coes. We speak of a brother and also a brethren, but though we say mother, we never say metherin. So plurals in English, I'll think you'll agree, are indeed very tricky, singularly. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So with this Danish mix now, we have now ended up, by the time the Normans arrive, we have ended up with Old English. I'm going to give you a burst of Old English. Yesterday, the weather was good. Today, storm up us with rain and hail show. We hidden under them haywagon. Now, later on, you're going to interpret that for me. No, don't look at me like that. If they can do it in Norfolk, we can do it down here in Essex. Right. And what we have done, we've now established a structure of English language. The structure is the same before the Normans arrived. Agincourt, during the Second World War. So therefore, Harold at Hastings, Henry at Agincourt, Winston Churchill in the Second World War used exactly the same structure. It hasn't changed. Spellings have changed, pronunciations have changed, we've taken words from around the world, but we haven't changed the structure, right? So we've now got, we're going to go back to that one, don't worry. The Normans now arrive, and the Normans, thank goodness, left the English language alone. They created a three-tier system. So French was first, spoken by the ruling classes. So you had the Normans and their cousins that followed, the Blois, the Anjous and the Plantagenets, right up to 1399. Latin was second in the church and the legal system, and English was a long way third. A long way third. It was 90% of the population still speaking English, right? The Normans had left it alone. Now, a lot of people say that the English language nearly died during the Normans. No, it didn't. It just wasn't written down very much. And to prove my point, how many people did you say we've got in the audience here today? 38, I think. 38. So we'll take three. Could these three people in the front row, could you stand up, please, and face the audience? Now, the Normans and the rest of them, Blois, Anjous and Plantagenets, never ever reached 10% of the population. So this is just under 10% of the population we've got here in this room today. So they represent the Normans. Come on. And all you are the English. Right, so which language is going to prevail? Their Norman French or your English? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for standing up. Thank you. That proves the point, doesn't it? English didn't die. It carried on. It really, really did. But what we did, we roughly took 10,000 words from the Normans, because the Normans were the big landowners. They were the sheriffs. They were the barons, right? And we took words from them. So much so that the animals and birds out there stayed Old English. But when it was then taken into the big houses and plonked on the plate, it then became Norman French. So it was a pig out there, and it was plonked on as porc and bacon. And then the sheep out there, it would be mouton, mutton. So therefore, they stayed Old English out there, and when it was plonked on a plate, it became Norman French. We also had words beginning with con, like continue, and we had words beginning with en, like engage, and words beginning with dis, like discontinue. Words ending in age, like courage and village and the things like that, and language. And words beginning with com, comments. So we roughly took 10,000 words from them and added it in to the English structure. But some of the English writers, they kept the English language alive, and they decided they would try and streamline the English language. And they did beyond measure, they really did. But they made it more difficult to read. They achieved this beyond measure. So in Old English, the vowels were A, E, I, O, U, Y. They were the 6 vowels. Later on, the Y was converted into a consonant, and we will cover that later on. So you had 6 characters for 6 sounds. If you put a macron, which is an accent that's horizontal, over each one, you elongate the sound of each of those vowels. So you've now created 6 more characters for 6 more sounds. Because we'd adopted the Latin alphabet, you had A and E together, and we had O and E together. Put an accent over each one of those, you've ended up with 16 characters with 16 different sounds. So, and once you've learnt all those, it's very easy to read Old English. You might not understand what you're reading, but you can read it because each character had one sound. What the English writers decided to do, they decided to get rid of all the accents. They converted the Y into a consonant, and they got rid of most of the ligatures. We've still got a few left over today when we say encyclopedia and archaeology and things like that, but even now we're losing them as well. So we ended up with 5 vowels with the same number of sounds. Now, during this period, what we're talking about, but also into the Tudors and Stuarts, was what was called the Great Vowel Shift. Now, nobody has ever said why the Great Vowel Shift occurred. Historians have put forward lots and lots of theories, but they don't know the real answer. One theory, because we started to talk towards gradually the front of the mouth, resonate towards the front of the mouth rather than the back of the mouth. So therefore, the sound of the vowels changed. Some say that because we're taking words from the Norman French and from other places, because they're foreign words, we've got to change the shape of our mouth to pronounce them. If you look at the skulls of people in that time, the teeth are on top of one another. Now you've got a big overbite. So therefore, with the changing shape of the jaw, were we now changing the shape of the way we spoke? And there's lots of other theories. But what we do know, it happened because people have wrote about it. So therefore, we've got things like, to give you a clue, C-L-E-R-C, cleric, cleric. That eventually changed to cleric, which we know, but also with the Great Vowel Shift, it became cleric, cloric, clerk. It became clerk. And what we do, we've just changed the C. We pronounce it as clerk, but we sell it as clerk. Right? Except when you've got a surname and we change that to an A. And the snooty ones put an E on the end. And also, with this Great Vowel Shift, it also changed sometimes the consonants that followed. So Old English again, F-O-L-C, folk, folk. But with the Great Vowel Shift, it became folk. And when you say faux, it's very difficult to pronounce the L. So then it becomes folk. We just put a K afterwards, folk. But if you go back to Old English, it was folk. And also with walk, it was welk. And then that changed eventually to walk, and we can't pronounce the L, but that's why we've got an L in the middle of walk today, because it used to be there and we used to pronounce it. Then you get places like, right, hurt. Hurt. Eventually became hort, eventually became heart. And it was the name for a 5-year-old red stag, red deer stag, or older. And where it used to go and drink down by the ford, it became known as Hertford. And then over time, it became known as Hertford. But we still spell it as Hertford. And Berkshire instead of Berkshire. and Clerkenwell instead of Clerkenwell. So we've still got old spellings, but we've still got the modern day spellings. I could give you a lot more examples of that, but there's examples of the Great Vowel Shift. So with the Great Vowel Shift that's happened, and reducing it to 5 vowels, that's why today the A can now be pronounced as A as in hate, A as in hat, E as in anything, or as in always, or as in swan. Lots of ways of now pronouncing the letter A. The E can be an A sound when we say greyhound and birds of prey. It can be an E sound when we say even. It can be an I sound when we say England. It can be an E sound when we say ever. The I can be an I sound, an I sound, an E sound. The O can be O as in of. It can be O as in over. It can be U as in going to. It can be a U sound when we say mother, brother and own. It can be a W sound when we say one. The U I'm going to take separately. When we adopted the Latin alphabet, the V and the U. The U was a soft version of the V. They were considered the same letter, and that's why they didn't appear separately until the 1600s, when they were then recognised as 2 different letters. And when you go into some old churches, you'll see August written down as AVGVST. Then they started to include the U in the text, but the V was the important letter. So therefore, words at the beginning would be with a V, and those in the middle of the word would be U. So upon would be written down as VPON, and heaven would have a U in it. And in the book that was referred to, In a Manner of Speaking, I've got the Middle English Lord's Prayer, and upon is written down as VPON and heaven with a U in it. And then it was not until the 1600s when it started to be separated out. Now the V can also be pronounced as an F. The U can be pronounced as a W. When we say language, quick and queen and penguin and the like, right? Now because of the U and the V swapping around, and because the V can be pronounced as an F and the U can be pronounced as a W, these 4 letters have swapped round through history. They really have. Now the W is peculiar to English and Welsh only. You will not find the letter W in any other European language. Had some funny looks. Okay, right. R-S-T-U-V-W. In French, R-S-T-U-V-W. Ce n'est pas W, c'est W. In Dutch, R-S-T-U-V, not W. In German, R-S-T-U-V, not W. Right? Because that W that was brought over by the Angles, they didn't have a letter for. So they put 2 U's side by side, then joined them up and called it a W. So they didn't have that over on the continent. They didn't have that W sound, only in little parts of Sweden, right? As a dialect, not part of the main standard language. But on the continent, they pronounced the V as a strong F and the W as a V. So that's why it's W or V, right? So over the continent, here we'll say it's a VW. In Germany, it's a VW. In Dutch, it's VV, right? So the W is peculiar to us. And in Welsh, it's an U sound. But when you say Gwen, because it's gu, and then N on the end, that's where the W sound comes in, so it's Gwen. And hopefully I've said that right, because there's a Welshman sitting in the audience. Right. And it still goes on today to a certain extent. How do we pronounce that, please? Because we pronounce it as a V. We then put an F afterwards, and it becomes, no, orf. No, you laugh, but I know it's orf, because King Charles says orf. Especially when he's talking to Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. I don't know what word goes before it. I was giving this talk in a church hall and the vicar said, I know what word goes before it, Mr. Haylock. I said, do you? He said, yes, clear. Right. How do we pronounce that, please? That's after we've done it. That's after we've done it. How do we pronounce it before we've done it? I'll have to make a phone call. I'll have to make a list. I'll have to do that. I'll have to do that. When we've done it, I have done. Yes? Then, L-I-E-U. Time in. Correct. But we also pronounce it as Leuf when we put tenant afterwards and it becomes lieutenant. So therefore, you now know why the U in lieutenant is pronounced as a F, because it's part of the U-V-W mix-up that's been going around. And if you've ever been to North Norfolk, S-T... Someone's got it over there, right? It was then, that was what was in the... so that's why you've got Stookie, pronounced as a W, and Stiff Key. And when you go into Stiff Key in Norfolk, you'll see Stiff Key on the top and Stookie on the bottom, because the locals still call it Stookie. And the cockles are Stookie Blues. Right, okay. The letter G, right? Now then, those tribes that came over pronounced that 4 different ways. So you had a G for garden, a J for George, a K sound. So if you go to Cockner up in Northamptonshire, C-O-G, right? And it's also in dialect English. When we say something, nothing and anything, right? We're pronouncing the G as a K. Nothing wrong with that at all until Standard English was invented in the late 1700s and then told us that was wrong. The other way it's pronounced, and this is a big group, was a Y, as a Y, a Y. If you ask a Swede today to pronounce Gothenburg, no. Who said yes? It's Göteborg. Shout it out.
Göteborg.
Thank you. Right? And on the top of Denmark, Jutland, S-K-A-G-E-N, Skane. So the G is pronounced as a Y. So when these English writers could hear, so although it's written down in the Domesday Book as Gipperswick, it was pronounced as Yipsage. Right? And the River Yare was written down as Gare, but pronounced Yare, and Garmouth written down, but became Yarmouth. So these English writers decided to convert the Y into a consonant and change the letter G to a Y. And I've seen maps of Ipswich with a Y on the front as Yipsage. And eventually the Y drops off, it becomes Ipswich. Right? But they got halfway through and then they realised that the other half was still pronouncing it the other way. So they downed tools. And that's why today we've got lots of words in the English language with a G in being pronounced as a Y. Sign, I sign my name. Then you've got my signature. Resign from my job. And then you've got resignation. Right. And you can have campaign, poignant, lots of reign, the Queen's reign, 18. So lots and lots of words in the English language with the G in being pronounced as a Y. Now you know why. So if I put some of these letters together, O-U-G-H, you can now see today why we have got 10 different ways of pronouncing O-U-G-H. Still goes on today. If I put an N at the front and a T at the end, round here we'll say it's naught. Go up north and it's nout to do with me, it's note to do with me, it's not to do with me. Put an E at the front and cross the T off and you've got enough. But if you look at the old Essex, North Essex dialect and Suffolk and Norfolk, that's enow. I've had enow of that. And my grandfather used to say a horse true. Right? Now, if you look up E-N-O-W in the dictionary, it'll say an archaic way of saying enough. Not in Norfolk and Suffolk again. So there was a presenter on BBC Radio. He decided that there should be one pronunciation of O-U-G-H. This would help foreign students learn the language. It would also be easier for young people to learn the language, and it would streamline the English language. And he suggested that it should have and ew pronunciation. Someone in the back room got on me and said, Dr. Charlie Haylock, we need you on here because this presenter is making an absolute fool of himself, but he didn't use those words. So I got introduced. Dr. Charlie Haylock, specialist in spoken English. Would you not agree with me that I said, cause mayhem? I totally disagree with you entirely. Cause mayhem. Yes, but it's no buts at all. It will cause mayhem. I said, therefore, did I go to Loughborough College? He said, where? I said, Loughborough. He said, where's that? I said, Loughborough. I said, look, you started this, not me. I said, and can you imagine me going to the doctor and say, doctor, can you help me, please? I've got a tickly cow. And then go to the chemist and ask for some cow drops. The phone went dead, yes. I could go through lots and lots of letters. The T is pronounced as a D in decrepit. The D is pronounced as a T when we slept and crept, right? And looked. And I could go through lots and lots. It's because we've never ever had, thank goodness, we've never ever had an official standard English. It has made English the richest language in the world because we've never ever had an official standard that straitjacketed it. It's all unofficial, thank goodness. So the writers that had kept the English language alive, you had John Wycliffe, right, eventually, because you had Chaucer, you had, lots and lots. John Wycliffe, he came out with the first handwritten Bible. John Gower, William Langland, Julian of Norwich, John Lidger, and of course Geoffrey Chaucer. And they all wrote in regional dialects, which was fantastic because we haven't got standard English. So we could put a little map together with all their different dialects, go over to the continent and see what a Jute had written and what an Anglo had written and what a Frisian had written. And you can see it all dovetailing into a lovely jigsaw puzzle and the bits all fix in. They really do. And then the big English breakthrough. Because we'd taken so many words from the Norman French, the Blois, the Anjous and the Plantagenet followed, the English language became greater than the Plantagenet French. And they recognised that. And so they then started to invite people like Chaucer into the French courts. Because the English language was a bit more ribald and it was a little bit more funny than what theirs, and it was richer. So that started to happen. And I'm going to give you a burst of Chaucer, the first few lines of the Miller's Tale, and you're now starting to hear readily more words that we understand now than I did in that last bit, which was the burst of Old English. So that little burst of Old English was, yesterday the weather was good. Yesterday the weather was good. Today storm up arras mid rain and hail shower. Today storm arose amid a rain and hail shower. We hidden under them hay wagon, we hidden under them hay wagon, or we hidden under them hay wain. So you can hear that there is English there, right? So this is Chaucer. Bearing in mind they still pronounce the rhotic R. The rhotic R is the R in the middle of the word and the end of the word. Not the erotic R, that's the R. Right. This is the R in the middle and the end of word. Wilhelm there was dwelling at Oxenford, a rich ganoff that guessed his heel to board, and of his craft he was a carpenter. With him there was dwelling a poor scholar, had learned art, but all his fantasy was turned to learn astrology. So you can start hearing now words that we easily recognise today. In 1399, there was a turning point in the English language. The Plantagenets have finished, and on the throne, Henry IV, an English person. Right now, yes, he was bilingual, but he was predominantly English, and he swore his allegiance in English, and Henry V that followed. So therefore, what happened, a lot of the French went home, English came to the fore, because they also decided, Henry IV and Henry V, all acts of Parliament will be now written in English and not in Norman or Plantagenet French. So English has now gone straight to the top, it really has. And it was a lasting breakthrough, it really was. 1473, William Caxton invented the first printing press. And the first thing he did was Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But with other things that were being written, it really did throw up all the different dialects in the country. And what happened then was that a call for standard English started to happen. And we then kind of come into the Tudors and Stuarts. So I'm going to finish here with the first half. And in the second half, I'm going to start from the Tudors and Stuarts and see how the Bible played a big part, how the Industrial Revolution made a big part, and how we started taking words from around the world, and how English became the richest language in the world. Lady at the front, hold on, lady at the front.
I wondered if you had any comment on the different pronunciation of H. There's H and H.
Right, there's been more books written on the letter H than all the other letters put together. Now, in Old English, right. Now, this in Old English has wheel, right? And then first of Beowulf, first word, what, right? Then a loaf of bread, loaf or laugh, great vowel shift, but the H gradually drops off and then drops off completely. Where there was a W, the H then went behind the word. Right. That's why Scots people still say, where are you going? What are you doing? Wheel, they still pronounce the H at the beginning, right? And so therefore, but the H on other words dropped off. By the time we get to the Tudors and Stuarts, because the H has dropped off the beginning of all words, there is a society for the pronunciation of the letter H. And I've got, I know we're jumping ahead here a bit, but this is a good one to end up on, right? The letter H. Right, here we go. At no point of English pronunciation have authorities more notoriously disagreed than the words beginning with H. And if anyone wishes to see the fathers of English at loggerheads or doctors of modern English pronunciation in a muddle, let them glance at the H section in their various dictionaries. Now, from one such publication we have, which is the poor letter H, its use and abuse, by the Honourable Henry H. He states that H is always to be sounded at the beginning of words, except the following, and all the words that are produced from them: heiress, honest, honesty, honour, honourable, herb, herbage, hospital, ostler, hour of the day, humour, humorous, humble, and humility. Now, another one, this was a much later, this is obviously a modern version of the letter H, past, present, and future, by Alfred Lynch. They would have a different say on how the letter H should be pronounced. And even today, we still don't know whether it's an hotel, a hotel, or an hotel, right? So we're now into James I time, right? The first of the Stuarts. And up until then, those controlling the country, if they were Protestant, Catholics got martyred. And if it was a Catholic on the throne, Protestants got martyred. But when James I came to the throne, there was more toleration. Catholics didn't like that, so they tried to blow him up on the 5th of November, right? But didn't succeed. The Protestants and the Puritans, they didn't like this toleration, so therefore a lot of them went off to America, and so they could keep their Protestant religion strict. But James I saw it through. But Catholics and Protestants still wanted to know who was who. So you couldn't go up to somebody and say, you Catholic, you Protestant. They couldn't do that. So they had to have other little ways of knowing. And the letter H was one of the little code words that they could. Now originally, right, because the lowercase h was shaped like a hatchet, it was hashe. With a great vowel shift it became hashe, right, and eventually haish. Right, the H drops off and it becomes H. What the Catholics decided to do, they went back to the old pronunciation, H, and the Protestants kept it as H. So in Catholic Mass and sermons and what have you, it would be Hallelujah and Hosanna. In Protestant, it would be Alleluia and Hosanna. And where there were Catholic strongholds in this country, East London, Liverpool, York, and the Republic of Ireland, right? H. And I think it's about 65-70% of Australians pronounce it as H, because the Catholic Church was very predominant in the education of original Australians, the Europeans that went out, not the Aborigines, right? So the difference is Catholic and Protestant. So one is H as Catholic, H as Protestant. Now, because we've got more people on television and radio being brought in from the with their dialects rather than standard English, we're hearing H on the radio and television more than we ever did before. So that's why there is a H and an H. It's up to you to decide whether it's right or wrong or not. But I think that both are acceptable, because we've not had a standard English saying which one is right. And this is why we can have these beautiful discussions, because we haven't had a straitjacket on our language.